This is the screencast for the review session for Unit 2 for Ms. Turner's AP Psychology class. There will be a few more multiple choice questions this time, 37, 2 FRQs, and there will be a few basic questions from Unit 1 so that you don't forget about that. And there's a lot of biological content, so make sure that you know this as well as if you were going to be teaching somebody else this information. That's how well you need to know this, forwards and backwards. I know you can do it, it just takes a lot of effort. So first of all, with the neurons, make sure you know the anatomy. We've practiced this a lot. We've done Play-Doh. We've acted it out. So I need you to know dendrites, axons, synaptic cleft, synaptic membrane. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Myelin sheath. Make sure you know all of those parts. Make sure you know about the neural firing components as far as what's happening to the little ions, the positive and the negative ions, which are happening along the axon when the action potential is going through. Make sure you also understand the firing principles of direction of impulse. It always goes up here from the dendrites through the cell body and then down the little axon, always, always. It's all or none. It either fires or it doesn't. And there has to be a minimum amount of stimulus to actually make it fire. That's called the threshold. As far as wiring and putting these neurons together, make sure you understand the importance of the myelin sheath, how that's deposited during childhood, and that insulates, it protects the axon and makes the message travel faster. When that breaks down, we suffer from MS, multiple sclerosis. Make sure you understand about the plasticity in the brain, how the brain can rewire itself, and the younger the better. Same with the critical periods, when that brain is really ready to learn. This happens in childhood. Pruning happens in adolescence when those neurons that aren't being used are cut away. And then the neural networks, those group of neurons that work together in order to help us achieve something, learn something, whatever it might be. There's a really nice graphic in your book, so I would go back and I would look under that for neural networks. Neurotransmitters, the little chemicals that are in the brain. A lot of misunderstanding with these from last year. Please make sure you've got mnemonics. I've given you all those little tricks to try to remember. So make sure that you recognize which each one does. And yes, some of them do overlap, so be aware of that. Note what associated disorders are with them, like Alzheimer's. That goes with acetylcholine, serotonin with depression, and so forth. Make sure you understand the difference between excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. And excitatory keep the message going, inhibitory are going to stop it. And there was the neurotransmitter coloring book that was not only online, but you also did that in your table groups. Now the man-made chemicals, not the neurotransmitters, those are excitatory and inhibitory, but the man-made that are like neurotransmitters are agonist and antagonist. Remember, they either fit in close enough like you're picking a lock. If it's an agonist, like a wagon wheel, they keep the message going, or it's like breaking off the key in the lock. If it's an antagonist, it stops the message from going through. Make sure you also remember the idea of reuptake inhibitors, what's working along at the dendrite level, what's working at the little terminal points of the axon. For the nervous system, make sure you know all the branches with these. Remember, there are two types of neurons, not only sensory motor, but the fancy name for sensory motor, afferent neurons. The fancy name for motor neurons are efferent neurons. And you need to know how this breaks down into the branches of the nervous system. This comes right from your reading. It breaks down to peripheral and central. The central is made up of the spinal cord and the brain in the center of our body. The peripheral around the outside of our body is broken down into the autonomic, which is like automatic functionings, and the somatic. Soma means body, so this is voluntary for the body. And then the autonomic automatic part of the nervous system breaks down into the sympathetic. Remember, we have sympathy for those who are always aroused, or the parasympathetic, like the parachute that slows us down. Make sure you can also match these with what's happening in parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the cerebellum. Hint, autonomic versus somatic. Brain structures, we've spent a lot of time reviewing those. Make sure you can not only label but also know the functions of the part of the brain. And a good way to do this is to practice, take any activity. I use texting and driving, and talk about which parts of your brain are being used for those activities. The opposite of using all of your brain is cerebral lateralization, when we've got that specialization of the hemisphere. Remember, left, logic, language; right tends to be the little more creative side. And make sure you practice your split brain findings. Remember that online we have Mr. Split Brainy if you want to practice that. But if it comes into the left visual field, then it's going to go into the right hemisphere, and that's going to then come back out on the left-hand side as far as manipulating it. If it comes into the right visual field, then it goes up to the left hemisphere with language, so we can say it, but if we're going to draw it, we have to take it back out to the right side. Again, diagrams, you've got several. Make sure you practice those. There will be at least one on the exam. Other things from the nervous system. Make sure that you know those brain imaging techniques, which one uses x-rays, magnets, electrodes, radioactive glucose, and which shows the structure versus the function. I believe I gave you a nifty little poem with that, hopefully, but I know there's some mnemonics with that, so make sure you go and double check those. Also, the limbic system, that specialized part of the brain, now I feel better. Amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus. And obviously that helps with it deals with our emotions. The endocrine system, all those different little glands throughout the body that transport our hormones. And there's the feedback loop between the endocrine system and the brain, which would be good for, I don't know, maybe an FRQ question, hint, hint. And so remember, we always start off in the brain, particularly with the hypothalamus, which is the master of the master gland. Sits right above the pituitary gland, which is what would be filled in there. And the pituitary gland then communicates with the other glands throughout the body, such as the adrenal glands. And this has the release of hormones into the bloodstream. And then as that's working its way through the body, it eventually goes back to the brain and tells us if we need to keep going or slow down or what we need to do about that. So I would definitely make sure you know that feedback loop. Oh, yeah, and here's an example. Apply to anger. What would happen, in the hypothalamus? What neurotransmitters would be released to go to the pituitary gland and so forth? From chapter 3, remember we just kind of hit some of the highlights of this chapter, but the whole idea was the interaction between nature and nurture. I'd pay particular attention to the significance of twin studies, showing us the importance of genetics, and shared genetics, I should say, versus the adoption studies that see what's the impact of nurture, or is something genetically enhanced. Genetic hierarchy of chromosomes, DNA, and genes. I can't remember what activity to do with that. We did some activities with that, so make sure you go back and check those. Heritability. Remember, this is a tough one because it's looking at a group measurement of genetics, but it's only based on, which is kind of the weird part, how similar or how different the environment is. So the more similar the environment, any differences then has to come from genetics. So that would be high heritability. The more diverse the environment, then the lower the heritability, because we don't know how much of the differences comes from genetics. So please go back and review that. Hey, and there's another little statement for you. It is a group measurement of the differences due to genetics, but you judge it based on the similarity of the environment. And also remember the evolutionary perspective. This is a little bit newer, but remember that's what functions that are passed down through the generations, things like sleep patterns and so forth. Your FRQ practice, okay? Let's pretend that an arrow passes through the brain. Which part of the brains would the arrow travel through if there was a problem with language? We got speaking and we got comprehension, so I would think Broca's area and Wernicke's area would play a part in that. Remembering, if we've got that lower brain that sits on that crescent moon, that sounds like an animal's name. Walking, well, we've got the motor strip on top of the head that goes from ear to ear, but we've also got the cerebellum as well that controls balance. Staying awake, we've got the pons that's going to help us with our sleep-wake schedule. We've got a little bit of the reticular formation as far as paying attention. That's really more about focusing than it is about staying awake. And based on what you know about brain wiring, what would be the effect as it relates to age? So again, you want to go back and look at critical periods, neuroplasticity, pruning. Those are some big concepts there. And some possible biological connections that help us maintain homeostasis, this balance. So again, are there transmitters or man-made chemicals that counteract each other, like Curare, for instance? Are there parts of the nervous system, like parasympathetic versus sympathetic, that kind of help us maintain homeostasis? That sort of thing. So those are good to review. Know your brain. That's it.